the shield wall is breaking. Exhausted, caked in mud, and bleeding, the men of Wessex gasp for breath in the cold January air. For weeks, they've been fighting a relentless war, a desperate struggle for the very survival of their kingdom. Before them, a seemingly endless tide of Viking warriors, screaming war cries, presses their advantage. Among the Saxon commanders is a young man, not yet king, his face a mask of grim determination. Alfred. But this day isn't going to be a victory. This wasn't a saga of glory. This was the Battle of Basing, a devastating defeat around January 22nd, 871, that nearly extinguished the dream of England forever. The West Saxon army was shattered, their hope was crushed, and their kingdom was brought to the very brink of annihilation. But to understand how Alfred's kingdom was driven to this precipice, we have to understand the storm that had descended upon England. Back in the latter half of the 9th century, the England we know today simply didn't exist. The land was a patchwork of rival Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. But one by one, they had fallen. The great kingdom of Northumbria, a center of learning and faith, was conquered. East Anglia, whose king was martyred, was now under Viking control. Mercia, the great power of Middle England, was fractured and teetering on the edge of collapse. This was the work of the Great Heathen Army, a massive coalition of Norse warriors who had arrived in 865 and systematically dismantled Anglo-Saxon power. These weren't just raiders looking for a quick score. They were an invasion force, seeking land, wealth, and permanent settlement. By the winter of 870, only one major kingdom remained defiant: Wessex, the kingdom of the West Saxons. It was the last bastion, the final shield against the total Viking conquest of England. All eyes, both Viking and Saxon, turned to this final, fateful confrontation. The survival of a people, a culture, and a future nation rested on the shoulders of one king and his younger brother. In December of 870, the storm finally broke over Wessex. The Great Heathen Army, under the command of Kings Bagsec and Halfdan, marched south and seized the strategic town of Reading. This was a brilliant tactical move. The town was nestled between the rivers Thames and Kennet, creating a natural fortress that the Vikings quickly reinforced with a rampart. From this fortified camp, they controlled the Thames Valley and had a secure base to launch devastating raids deep into the heart of Wessex. They were no longer just an army on the march. They were an occupying force, and their target was Winchester, the capital of Wessex. The West Saxons, led by their king Ethelred and his 21-year-old brother Alfred, had no choice but to respond. The stage was set for one of the most brutal and rapid-fire campaigns in English history. A flurry of battles, all fought in just a few short weeks in the dead of winter, would decide the fate of the kingdom. The first clash came on New Year's Eve, 870, at Englefield. A Viking foraging party was ambushed by a local Saxon force led by an ealdorman named Ethelwulf. It was a clear Saxon victory, a much-needed morale boost that proved the Vikings weren't invincible. But this was just the prelude. 4 days later, on January 4th, 871, King Ethelred and Alfred led a full-scale assault on the Viking stronghold at Reading. The Saxons fought bravely, but attacking a fortified position held by a battle-hardened army is a brutal business. The attack was repulsed. The Vikings surged from their gates and drove the West Saxons back in a bloody defeat. Ealdorman Ethelwulf, the hero of Englefield, was killed in the fighting. It was a harsh lesson in the true strength of their enemy. Yet just 4 days after that disaster, the Saxons would achieve their greatest victory of the war. On the windswept chalk downs known as Ashdown, the two armies met again. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle tells a story of a divided command. King Ethelred was busy praying in his tent, refusing to fight until Mass was finished. Meanwhile, the Viking army was already deploying for battle. Alfred, faced with a terrible choice, wait for his brother and get overwhelmed or attack without the king's command, made a decision that would define him: he ordered the advance. The chronicle says he charged like a wild boar up the hill, crashing into the Viking shield wall. The battle raged for hours, a brutal, grinding melee. Eventually, King Ethelred joined the fight, and the combined Saxon force managed to break the Viking line. The Norsemen fled, pursued by the Saxons late into the night. It was a stunning victory. Among the dead was a Viking king, Bagsec himself. Hope, which had seemed all but lost, was rekindled. The triumph at Ashdown was glorious, but it came at a terrible cost. The West Saxon army was badly mauled, exhausted from weeks of relentless marching and fighting in the bitter cold. They had proven they could beat the Vikings in an open battle, but the Great Heathen Army had deep reserves and an unyielding will. About 2 weeks later, on or around January 22nd, 871, the two armies met again. This time, the battle took place near the royal estate of Basing in modern-day Hampshire. Strategically, this location was vital, lying on the route toward the West Saxon capital, Winchester. The details of the Battle of Basing are scarce, a testament to the chaos and trauma of the time. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle simply states that the West Saxons fought, and the Vikings had the victory. There's no heroic tale of Alfred's charge, no mention of specific triumphs, just the cold, hard fact of defeat. After the high of Ashdown, the grim reality of a war of attrition had set in. You see, the Saxon army, the Fyrd, was largely a militia of farmers and landowners, not a professional force that could sustain campaign after campaign. The Vikings, on the other hand, their entire existence was dedicated to warfare. At Basing, the already weakened Saxon army was simply overwhelmed. They fought for their homes, for their king, and for their lives, but it wasn't enough. The Viking victory was decisive. The Saxon shield walls, which had held so firm at Ashdown, were broken. The army that Ethelred and Alfred had led was shattered. Morale plummeted. The victory at Ashdown now seemed like a distant memory, a flicker of light before a suffocating darkness. For Alfred, this defeat was a crushing personal blow, casting serious doubt on his ability to protect his people. The kingdom was now more vulnerable than ever. Following the disaster at Basing, an eerie quiet fell over Wessex for about 2 months. It wasn't a truce. It was the silence of pure exhaustion. The West Saxons were too broken to muster another major army, and the Vikings were likely reinforcing and resupplying. But the war wasn't over. On March 22nd, the fighting resumed at a place called Meryton, and once again, the Saxons were defeated. The kingdom had suffered 3 major defeats in as many months. The cost in manpower was catastrophic. Then, shortly after Easter of 871, the final blow fell. King Ethelred died. The cause is unknown. He may have died from wounds sustained in battle, or simply from the sheer stress and sickness that plagued the campaign. His death left Wessex leaderless at the worst possible moment. The man who stepped forward to take the crown was his younger brother, Alfred. He was just 21 years old, and he inherited a kingdom that was, for all intents and purposes, defeated. His army was a shadow of its former self, his treasury was empty, and a victorious Viking army was still camped on his soil. This wasn't a glorious coronation. It was the acceptance of a poisoned chalice. He was now king of a realm on the absolute verge of extinction. The year 871 was a crucible of fire and blood for the kingdom of Wessex. The winter campaign saw a rapid succession of brutal battles, a small win at Inglefield, a disaster at Reading, a miraculous victory at Ashdown, and then the crushing, decisive defeats at Basing and Meryton. The Battle of Basing stands as the critical turning point in this desperate struggle. It was the moment the momentum gained at Ashdown was utterly destroyed, proving that a single victory, no matter how glorious, wasn't enough to stop the Viking tide. It was the battle that broke the West Saxon army and brought Alfred's kingdom to its knees. The dream of a unified, independent England was never closer to being erased forever. Alfred had survived, but he was now king of a broken land. He had no army, no clear path to victory, and no reason to believe he could succeed where his brother had failed. And yet somehow he did. The story of what happened next, of how Alfred rallied, how he reformed his armies, and how he ultimately saved his kingdom to become the only English monarch known as the Great, is a tale for another time. So, how did Alfred snatch victory from the jaws of absolute defeat and lay the foundations for the England we know today? If you want to find out, make sure you subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. You won't want to miss the next chapter in this incredible saga. Thanks for watching.